This is Unit 4, and for Unit 4 we chose Question 3. Question 3 reads as follows. The framers wrestled with the language of Article 2, Section 1 to give the President sufficient power without giving him excessive power, as well as to free him from excessive dependence on the legislature, while at the same time assuring that he did not become an elective monarch. To what extent have the framers' hopes been realized? What evidence can you offer to support your position? And with that, Article 2, Section 1 gives the President executive power but does not define what that power is. How would you define executive power, and what examples can you cite of the presidents using their executive power? And finally, how can Congress check the exercise of the President's power? And you may begin.
The framers, in drafting Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, were greatly varied in their opinions of what the executive should consist of. Their experiences under the abusive unitary system of Great Britain and the incompetent administration under the Articles of Confederation led them to believe in very different roles for the executive.
Thomas Paine, negatively influenced by a strong executive, stated in his pamphlet, Common Sense, "For as in absolute governments, the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other." The Articles of Confederation reflected this fear of a strong executive and that there was no executive at all. This fear led to the variation in belief in executives, exemplified in the 3 plans proposed during the Constitutional Convention.
The Virginia plan had the executive chosen by the legislature. The New Jersey plan suggested multiple executives appointed by Congress, and the New York plan had the executive deemed governor, who would serve a life term and have an absolute veto. This plan, written by Alexander Hamilton, expresses the failures he saw in no executive during the Revolutionary War as General Washington's aide-de-camp.
The term executive power, as used in Article 2, Section 1, was written so ambiguously that it opens up for varied interpretation. We agree with presidential scholar Richard M. Pius, who defines executive power as the general responsibility to direct the bureaucracy.
This duty gives the President ultimate powers over the Cabinet and the coinciding departments and agencies. This also allows the President to make appointments, control the budget, as well as issue executive orders and craft executive agreements.
With George Washington as their model, the founders drafted Article 2, which gives sufficient powers to the executive, and is exemplified by Washington's actions during the 1789 Whiskey Rebellion, one of the first real tests of executive authority. This fixed the problems under the Articles of Confederation and prevented an elective monarch.
This sufficient executive power has allowed presidents such as Abraham Lincoln to act in times of crisis without strict adherence to the Constitution, by suspending the writ of habeas corpus, nationalizing the militia, and imposing a blockade on southern ports. This can also be seen in presidents such as Franklin Roosevelt with his expansion of the president's role in the economy via his New Deal and John F. Kennedy's actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Additionally, the framers wanted to prevent the President from having excessive power due to their experiences under the oppressive British government. President Thomas Jefferson, although he originally campaigned to reduce the power of the President, used his implied powers to purchase the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. Moreover, President Andrew Jackson used his executive power to ignore the Supreme Court's decision in Worcester v. Georgia.
In 1982, the Boland Amendment was added to the Military Authorization Act as an attempt to check the executive branch, but was ignored by President Ronald Reagan and his advisors, leading to the Iran-Contra affair.
Although the framers attempted to create the checks and balances systems to have, as James Madison stated in Federalist 51, ambition check ambition, the President has excessive dependence on the legislature.
President Woodrow Wilson attempted to ratify the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, but the Senate refused to approve the treaty under their powers in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. Congress has also checked the President's power of executive orders through legislation and appropriations. For example, President Barack Obama issued an executive order closing the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, which Congress, by using their power of the purse, prevented its closure.
Although the framers wanted to create a system to free the executive from congressional control, they also attempted to ensure the President didn't become an elective monarch. As historian Joseph J. Ellis wrote, President Washington was recognized as primus inter pares, the foundingest father of them all. Thus, his decision to not serve a 3rd term set the precedent for future presidents regarding term limits.
However, when President Roosevelt successfully ran for a 4th term, the idea of an elective monarch and the fears therein led to the 22nd Amendment, which upholds the framers' ideals limiting a president to serving 2 terms.
Thomas Cronin's Paradox of the American Presidency best encompasses the issues with Article 2, Section 1 by saying, "We demand dynamic leadership, yet grant only limited powers to the president." Thank you.
Okay. Framer George Mason said, the purse and the sword must never be in the same hands. How is this idea reflected in the War Powers Resolution?
Well, the War Powers Resolution was the revolution in Vietnam in which Congress mandated the president that he could only send troops into a specific area for 30 days, and then the president could ask for a 60-day extension. The problems with this is that it was only a resolution and not an act.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Framer George Mason said, the purse and the sword must never be in the same hands. How is this idea reflected in the War Powers Resolution?
Also, with the resolution, the Treasury was the purse, and the president was supposed to be the sword who executed it and whatnot. Though we've seen that, as we have, that they're not in the same hands.
This idea of the sword and the purse not being in the same hands is reflected in the War Powers Resolution, in that Congress, who has the power of the purse, is taking away the right, that right from the president, who could, without the War Powers Resolution, could send troops into a territory at any time, and Congress would have to fund it because troops were over there. And so this War Powers Resolution, although never enforced, the idea is that the president does not have the power of the purse as well as the sword.
A current example of this is our recent conflict in the Middle East, in which President George Bush put troops over there, and then our Senator Harry Reid said that, threatened multiple times to not fund the soldiers in Iraq, but that would essentially be political suicide. So that's why the War Powers Resolution does not have enough power behind it.
Jumping off of that, it seems that with the War Powers Resolution and other phenomena in the 20th century, scholars have described the presidency as an imperial presidency. Would you agree with the notion that today that the office of the president is truly an imperial office?
I would agree with the fact that, with the statement that the office of the presidency is an imperial office. You can look at, as we mentioned in our testimony, Jefferson purchasing the Louisiana Territory. That's imperialism at its best, just taking another part of America and saying this is ours. And a lot of other presidents have also been imperialist in their foreign policy. However, they claim to not be.
Another great example of this is President James K. Polk, who invaded the Nueces River in 1846 without any threat of attack from the Mexicans. So I think that there's an incorrect statement in that saying that it's in the 20th century. I think that it's been expanded throughout the president's history.
And if you want to look more modernly, you can look at President George Bush Sr., who originally was very big in the Middle East and started a lot of affairs. Was a part of a lot of affairs in the Middle East, and which we are still involved in today.
A scholar has written that some presidents, or maybe most presidents, have drawn heavily on the example of President Lincoln as their example of why and how they can expand presidential power. Do you agree with that position? And and either way, give me your examples.
I do agree with this example because, as we also stated in our testimony, President Lincoln suspending the writ of habeas corpus, Congress allowed this to happen and never was formally against it, coming out saying that the president was completely wrong in doing so.
Presidential scholar Richard M. Pius said that if the legislation is successful, questions of legitimacy recede to the background, and I think that's a perfect example. Abraham Lincoln is a perfect example of this with Ex parte Milligan and Ex parte Marion.
You can also see President Lincoln's the Emancipation Proclamation, where they did not actually legitimately in slavery or free all slaves. It was more of a ploy to unite the North for a cause for the Civil War. So they weren't just fighting to preserve the Union, they were fighting to end slavery and this morally unjust thing that was going on in the nation. And this reflects the way that presidents afterwards have used the media in order to get public opinion to sway towards them, or to use or gain powers, if not actually, but perceptually.
Go ahead.
When George Washington first took office, there were only 3 departments of the executive branch. It was the War Department, the Treasury, and the State Department. Today we have umpteen departments, hundreds and dozens of agencies. How can you explain the growth of the executive branch over the past 200 years? And B, is it constitutional?
I think you can explain that growth in the growing size of our nation, and that you need all of these agencies and something like the EOPs of the president, the executive office of the president, and the White House staff. So I think that definitely is a justification that the sheer size of our country has gone up greatly. So I think that's why.
To answer the second part of your question, the constitutionality of it, I believe it is constitutional in that Congress has allowed it to happen. Congress has to approve all of the developments of these agencies, and as well as Article 2, where the president, all of the powers of the president are delineated, isn't so specific that prohibits him or Congress from creating these agencies or departments, and therefore it is constitutional.
A good example of this is after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security was created as a new branch because at the time it was felt that it was needed.
Okay, I'm going to ask an opinion question. Which of the presidential powers do you believe is the most unlimited? Which of the presidential powers do you believe is the most unlimited that the president has?
I believe that the power of executive orders is most unlimited, because the president can, although it affects the public sector, everything that his executive powers are overseen, as Mr. Scott Daniel just previously stated, that the executive branch has expanded so greatly that executive orders are very powerful and almost entirely unchecked.
Though not a specific power, as my colleague Kayleen just stated, the president has a large power with the media and speaking to the citizens of America, starting with the fireside chats, leading all the way up to our current President Obama, who weekly has a YouTube video that comes out and addresses the American people, and also recently using a Google video, using Google Plus to exemplify a video question and answer.
I would say Commander-in-Chief and for examples that we've already mentioned, like President James K. Polk and President Bush, because it's very hard for a congressman to say, I'm not going to fund the troops anymore, because that is, like I previously mentioned, political suicide.
Tell me this, you talked a little about War Powers Resolution and President sending troops overseas, but many presidents have used the same powers within our country, Steel Strike and Alabama, and where's the justification for that? I mean, does the president have power to basically invade a state and or cause it to follow federal rules? Where does that come from?
Sorry. The only case that I believe that the president has the power to instill basically what I would infer as a martial law is if there's rioting, or as in the case of it in the early 90s, there was the race riots in LA over the beating of Rodney King and the injustice, and martial law was installed in there, and federal law was regulated, and that is the only instance in which the president may put federal laws upon states.
I think it's completely unjust, and you can look at the case of Worcester v. Georgia, in which the Supreme Court ordered that removal of Native Americans from Georgia was not constitutional, yet President Andrew Jackson completely ignored that decision. So no, I don't believe that presidents should have that power.
The founders, when creating the Constitution, because they were so afraid of the monarch and whatnot, they also put in the Constitution that you were not allowed to quarter soldiers in people's homes. And as Kayleen stated, that when there's a revolt or a riot happening, that the government does have the right to step in, but the founders have limited the major ability for soldiers to take power.
And my colleague means the Bill of Rights,
Yes.
and not the Constitution. It's for part of the soldiers.
Okay. I think you guys did an outstanding job of just answering the question directly and getting, cutting to the chase. And I think that obviously this is a relatively dry subject area.
This is not dry.
Relatively. I like it. It's relatively in the sense that it can be very mechanical. And I think you did a very good job of doing that. A couple of things, just kind of constructive criticism. One thing I would not make sure that you are constantly on the offensive with your examples. I like the James K. Polk example with the Mexican-American War. You use it once, and unless you're asked again about James K. Polk, or you have to answer with that, move forward to another example. Because circling back to the same example gives the impression, and I know this isn't true, that that's all you know. And that's the limit of your knowledge. And I know that that's not true. I liked actually Miranda, the way that you kind of answered a different aspect of Sam's question, in the sense that you said you decided to answer the idea of the fireside chat and soft power. What I would do is I would kind of use terminology like that idea, that concept of presidential soft power, use that as a way, as kind of a stepping stone into the rest of it. And Kayleen, I thought you did an excellent job, and I think you all flowed very well, and you picked each other up very well. So it was good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought you answered the question well. I thought that you sufficiently answered the question. A couple things with the, this is not a dry subject either. This isn't one of my
Relatively speaking.
One of the things with the question Mark asked, there are several examples of when federal troops were called in. Eisenhower called in the troops in Little Rock to segregate the schools and things like that. So yeah, the president can, when he chooses to, call in military. And so you got to understand, you gave there was the one example that he gave. I mean, it even happened in Tonopah in 1901, if you want to go back that far. So where Roosevelt sent troops to quiet down mine strike in Goldfield, Nevada in 1901. So troops are here. Troops can be deployed at any point, whether it be nationally or internationally. Okay, so no, that's the historical part of this question. Other than that, I thought you answered the question well. I tried to get you on that first question because I asked you that a long time ago, and you stumbled on it, but this time you didn't. You did okay, and that's what I always do. I always give a question first. If you have a problem with it, you'll always hear it again later because I want to see what you've learned from that. And you did a good job on answering my questions, so I'm pleased with it.
I think you did an excellent job. There's a lot of really good examples. Your testimony has a lot of great references, and you had a lot of good stuff in your cross-exam as well. I will say that, just to offer a couple of criticisms. One is, you get through 6 questions in 10 minutes. If your answers are a little bit shorter, you're going to get to 7 or 8, and that's probably going to give you a little more chance to show off what you know. I think I told you this the last time I saw you, and I'll repeat it for you guys and the other groups. If you answer something that you're taking out of your testimony and you're kind of repeating it, don't say, as we said in our testimony. Because what it does is it sounds like you're telling us, didn't you listen to us? This is what we said before. So just give the same example, that's fine, or expand on it. You did a good job there. I mean, you're giving the right example, it's just, you don't need to tell us that. as Sam was talking about on domestic, I thought it was a really good example using the idea, calling it martial law. I think that was a very good use. And I think that you can tie that back into one of the other questions, which was the expansion of presidential power through agencies. Well, there's kind of an unlimited power that goes with those agencies, and one of those is, what do we do with the National Guard? It is military, so, the only other thing is, I will tell you, I listen to groups a lot. Well, one person, and then I'll go back to the positive. I know that you answered all of question 3, but the part that's in bold, the kind of preamble part of the question, I'm a firm believer in, if you tell the judges, I'm answering the question, here's how I'm answering the question, and I've answered the question. I didn't get that out of the bold part. I got it specifically out of the 2 bullet parts, but not as much as the bold parts. You might take a look at that and maybe fine tune a little bit. And then I hear always, as my colleague said, Miranda, when you said, as Kayleen stated, that's fantastic. Because what you've just done is you've personalized that answer. So you guys did very good in that teamwork. And I think that, you can be very respectful and say my colleague, but then we're all wondering which colleague you're talking about when 2 of them have answered the question. So Miranda saying it specifically, that was really good. So good job.
Thank you.
I got just one special request to go out of order, and for this judge I will, is to do Unit 1, so that we can do that. So we're going to just transfer and get out of order. Sorry, so Unit 1, you're up next.
You're fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.